Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Philippa Howden-Chapman, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Sustainable Cities. And today we've got an extra special treat because it's the first in our presentations from one of our major strands of work from Resilient Urban Futures program, which is a 4-year MBIE-funded program. And one of the first things that they wanted was that we had to analyse what the drivers were of urban change. And we have a major report published from this, which is going to be released in Parliament on December the 1st. But actually one of the very interesting pieces of work that we did, incorporated as part of that, was a national survey. And it's this survey that the two people in our Resilient Urban Futures program, Anna Hammer-Adams and Ed Randal, are going to speak to you about today. Ed is a research fellow with us at the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities, and he's worked on a number of the strands in our program. There are 9 strands in the program. He's interested in developing a better understanding of the complex processes and interactions within urban, social, ecological systems to improve health, well-being and sustainability. And his work focuses particularly on transport and urban development. And Anna, who we're going to have to say goodbye to next year, she's beginning work at Treasury, so been great to have her for the year, is an assistant research fellow at the New Zealand Centre here, and she's been involved in the research on the drivers of urban change, and she brings a strong interest in the dichotomy of stated versus revealed preferences to the analysis of the survey results she's presenting today, and she studied postgraduate economics at the Victoria University of Wellington. So they're going to speak now. Ed will be speaking first, and then Anna, and then Rafe Chapman's we're going to have 20 minutes questions, and then Rafe Chapman's going to sum up.
First I'll start off giving you a bit of a summary of what I'm going to talk about exactly. So I'm going to briefly give you an overview of the Resilient Urban Futures program, which is the overarching program that this work comes under. I'll then briefly talk about the Drivers of Urban Change project. This work that we're talking about today forms a chapter of that report. I'll then talk about the background to the survey, a bit about why we're interested in this topic, and then talk about what we actually did, and then I'll hand over to Anna to talk about some results, give some conclusions, and then Rafe will give some summaries and some thoughts right at the end. First of all, I'd just like to briefly acknowledge a few people. Mainly the staff at the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities and the project team for all their work on writing the survey, helping edit and proofread the chapter and give their thoughts. Dallas Sim for help with analysis, and of course Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment for funding the survey. The poll that we are using was conducted by Horizon Research, and of course we'd like to thank all the survey respondents. So Resilient Urban Futures, as Philippa said, it's a Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment funded research program. It's 4 years, started in 2012. It's hosted by the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities, the group that we work for, which is based in the Department of Public Health at the University of Otago here. There are also researchers from 4 other New Zealand universities, as well as some researchers from NIWA, Motu and some other research groups around the country. So there are 9 research strands in this program, covering topics from urban development, planning and governance, transport, water and air quality, and other topics. And it is in its last year. And there's more information on that website for anyone that wants it. So one of the key strands of this research program is the Drivers of Urban Change. This strand brings together the program as a whole and combines this with interviews from over 80 key stakeholders and policymakers from 5 cities in New Zealand, Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin. These cities have been involved in some of the other projects of Resilient Urban Futures as well. And the purpose of this project is to explore the factors that influence the development of cities in New Zealand. The report is currently with the publishers and will be launched at Parliament on the 1st of December. So one of the key reasons why this research is so important is that many of New Zealand's cities, as a number of cities around the world, have not been developing in a particularly sustainable way. This top left picture is a picture from the 1920s of Mount Eden. It's described as a sprawling suburb when this photo was taken. And on the right, we've got a photo from today, taken from Google Street View, of the same area. And you can see that the small dispersed houses sort of spread even further into the distance, maybe. Population growth, transport issues, housing affordability, inequality and climate change mean that the quarter-acre dream, which you can see sort of down in this bottom right-hand corner, is not particularly viable anymore. Councils and central government are under pressure to balance the provision of affordable housing, good transport, resilient infrastructure, and to limit the loss of fertile land at the city fringe, while still maintaining high levels of livability and encouraging healthy and happy communities. The big question is, can all these outcomes be sustainably achieved within the constrained environment that we operate in? So a number of researchers and practitioners from New Zealand and around the world are proposing solutions to some of these problems in the idea of compact smart growth development. This involves increased density, mixed land use, multiple transport modes and affordable housing. The top two pictures give examples of this. The left one's an example of a European city showing multiple transport modes and a bit of higher density living in the background there. The right is a proposed mixed-use higher density development from Oakland, California. At this point, I'd just like to point out that it was not intentional to have all the bad examples being from Auckland, and the one New Zealand example on this page being Wellington. When you do Google compact cities in New Zealand, you do get a lot of photos of Wellington. Having said that, Wellington does have its own problems. While most of the areas in this particular photo are compact, when you look a bit further out, there are plenty of examples of sprawling suburbs and plenty of room for further intensification. So there are a number of organisations around the world, including the IPCC, the UN, the WHO, and others, who actively encourage planners to think about the interactions between where people live, where they work, where they like to shop, the transport options available to them, and what this really means for the choices they make in transport and also where they choose to live. There are many proven health, economic and environmental benefits of cities that are designed to encourage active and socially connected lifestyles, where decision makers have really thought about their cities as complex systems rather than isolated sectors. Many councils in New Zealand know all of this already. A number of those interviewed for the Drivers of Urban Change stated that they want to address some of these issues and promote more resilient and sustainable development and encourage compact growth. However, councils often find it difficult to effect the legislative and policy changes required to get these substantial changes through, especially when trying to balance the conflicting interests and listen to the views expressed during the standard consultation processes. As this is a significant change from the business as usual, councils require significant support from the public. So one of the reasons why we wanted to carry out the survey is to really find out what does the public really want. We also wanted to see how generalisable the views of our key informants from the drivers' interviews really were. So in 2009, researchers from the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities conducted a survey to find out what New Zealanders wanted in terms of their types and location of housing and transport options, and also what they really thought about planning regulations. So this was published in a book, Sizing Up the City, in 2009 or early 2010. That survey showed that most people still wanted their standalone house on a large section. However, when you look into this a bit deeper, this is strongly linked with life stage. The standalone house preference is definitely prevalent in people of childbearing age, as you might expect. But small houses and apartments are becoming increasingly popular with the other age groups. Respondents also indicated that they were very keen to be within walking and cycling distance of many of the key destinations that they need to get to. They also felt that urban limits that restrict development within a city boundary were needed to encourage sustainability and get their cities developing along the lines that they would prefer. Related to this, they felt that councils should be the ones in charge of these sorts of regulations rather than leaving these up to market forces. So we decided that we wanted to have another look at these questions and run another survey that updated this knowledge and looked at what has changed over the last 6 years. So we repeated many of the 2009 survey questions. We also added some new questions that looked at different aspects of urban governance, including affordable housing provision, climate change policy, zoning rules, issues of trust, and inequality in society. So the survey was conducted in early 2015 using a nationwide online horizon poll. We got 3,080 respondents. We used the same methodology and weighting in the 2009 survey. We really wanted the two results to be comparable. So this talk will now focus on urban form and housing preferences expressed in this survey, and how this fits into a more resilient and sustainable future for our urban centres. The zoning, trust and inequality issues will be further discussed at the driver's launch, so it's quite hard to fit everything in today. So on that note, I'd just like to hand over to Anna for the results.
Excellent. All right, so thank you very much, Ed. As Ed said, my name is Anna, and I'm going to be taking you through the results. So one interesting thing we found when comparing the 2009 results to the 2015 results was actually preferences didn't really differ that much. So instead of taking you through all of the graphs with both results side by side and both of them looking the same, I'm just going to point out where they differ significantly. So that's one of the first results we found. But if you're already familiar with the 2009 survey results, please don't leave just yet. We've also added some new survey questions to the survey. All right. So first off, we just wanted to establish a baseline. So we asked respondents, which would you most prefer to live in, and which would you least prefer to live in? And we gave them the options of a standalone house, a townhouse, an apartment, or with people didn't mind, or some other type of dwelling. And here we have the results. On the y-axis, we've got the percentage of respondents who chose that option. And I've put the two questions together. So in the brown columns, we've got what people most prefer to live in, and then in the sandy colour columns, we've got what people least prefer to live in. And as you can see, the results seem to be pretty clear. Most people, when asked in an ideal situation, would most prefer to live in a standalone house. And in an ideal world, most people would not want to live in an apartment. However, as Ed pointed out, we're operating in quite a constrained environment, both economically, in terms of infrastructure costs, and environmentally, with regards to sustainability. So people do need to take some more things into account when they're making the decisions about where to live. So we decided to broaden the question out a little bit further. So instead of just saying, in an ideal world, what house would you choose? Now we're asking about, where would you prefer to live, taking location into account? So the options we gave were, which would you prefer, a larger house further out, or a smaller house, townhouse, or apartment in the city centre? Or perhaps people didn't mind. And the preferences again are quite clear. Most people preferred a larger house further out, with a slightly higher percentage of people wanting a smaller house, townhouse, or apartment in the centre of the city or town. Some people didn't mind, and some people had other preferences. Now, what I find most interesting about these results is that when you compare to the ideal situation, where 80% of people said they preferred a standalone house, now only about 55% of people want a larger house further out. So, while this is still a majority, this percentage has definitely decreased, so it shows a couple of things here. Mainly that people take into account a whole range of factors when deciding where to live, and that the house itself is perhaps, for some people, not the most important factor. But we can break these preferences down a bit more. So here I've separated them out by age. We saw in the 2009 survey that results depended a lot on age and life stage, and here we see the same results again. So I've got on the y-axis the percentage of respondents. So each column here shows the percentage of respondents in each age category who chose this respective option. So brown is people who preferred a larger house further out, yellow, a smaller house in the centre of the city, blue, don't mind, or green, other. And as you can see, most age groups have a preference for larger houses further out, although between the 18 and 24 group and the 55 to 64 group have a higher preference for a smaller house compared to the middle age ranges, where the preference for a larger house further out peaks between about 25 and 44. So we hypothesise that this is related to life stage. But one of the most interesting results, in my opinion, definitely comes when you look at the 65 years or over age category. Here, most respondents wanted a smaller house, townhouse or apartment in the city centre. So this is pretty interesting, most of all for the fact that really when I think of people who live in apartments, I don't think of the elderly, I think of young people. So this is quite a game changer in terms of results. Also, it's quite significant in the context of an ageing population. We also broke it down into cities and also the type of households, and we found that Auckland and Wellington respondents, people who flattered or were in boarding situations or single person households, all of these groups were also more likely to say they preferred a smaller house, townhouse or apartment than other groups who responded. However, when we're thinking about location, there are a couple of things that come into mind, and the previous question didn't really separate that out for us. So here we've asked this question in a slightly different way, really focusing on the commuting aspect of location. So we asked, in your opinion, is having space in a house more important to me than a longer commuting time, or is having a short commute to work or other activities more important than the type of house you live in? Now, I imagine that people's responses to this question are probably influenced by the type of transport options they have available and how gnarly their commutes are in the morning. Likewise, people's views of apartments are probably skewed by their own experiences. This definitely was my experience as a student flatting in Wellington and Palmerston North. However, there are also other options out there. So on the left, we've got a really charming apartment in Paris, and then on the right, we've got our own Clyde Quay. Okay, so here were the results. Most people again said having space is more important than a longer commute time. However, I've got two columns here. In the brown, those are the 2009 results. In the sandy colour, those are the 2015 results. You can see here that between 2009 and 2015, the proportion of respondents who said that having a shorter commute is more important than any other aspect of housing, that increased by about 10%. So that's quite interesting. In my mind, it looks like that this increase has come from a decrease in the proportion of respondents saying, I don't mind. So it seems like people are really making up their views on this subject. We also broke this down by where people lived as well. Auckland and Wellington respondents, again, were more likely to prefer shorter commutes than other groups. And we also found that men were more likely to say that they preferred to have a short commute compared to women. All right, but location, sure, work is quite an important part of most of our lives, but people also like to be in close proximity to other amenities. So we asked, would you prefer to live within walking and or cycling distance of a number of main amenities, including work, food and grocery shopping, etc.? And we asked this question separately for each type of amenity. So we gave the options for saying yes, no, not a concern for me, or don't know. Okay, this graph is quite complicated. Ignore it for the second. Most people's responses tended to range between 40 and 60% of people saying, yes, I want to live within walking and cycling distance of this amenity. The next most popular option were people who said not a concern to me. And so this was kind of baffling until we broke it down by age. So here you can see each of the lines across show the percentage of respondents who said yes to each of the different options. So for instance, most people across all age groups wanted to live within close proximity of food and grocery shoppings, which I definitely very much understand. In addition to that, most people also wanted to live in close proximity to public transport stops. However, as you can see, after the 35 to 44 year age bracket, most people in the older age brackets didn't mind as much about being in proximity to schools and to work. So it definitely shows there's variance in people's views, and their age and life stage definitely should be taken into account. So we've seen that most people want to be in close proximity to a number of amenities that are important to them. But why does this matter? This question here is focused at trying to see whether these personal preferences translate into policy preferences at a city level. So we asked that rather than planning that separates residential subdivisions and commercial areas, do you approve in principle of mixed-use development that put housing within walking and or cycling distance of some of the main amenities that we asked about in the previous questions? And we found for the most part, people did approve in principle of mixed-use development, with about 60% of people either approving or strongly approving with this idea. And when we broke it down by age, we found young people were also more likely to approve of mixed-use development. And I find those results really resonate with me, for instance, because the number of youth, for instance, who don't have their driver's licence is really increasing. I, for one, am one of them. In addition, youth are also more likely to be constrained financially as well, so maybe not able to afford cars or other forms of transport. Okay, so we've talked about mixed-use development, people walking and locational preferences, but what about where people live? Like, this is what we're really interested in. So we wanted to try and shed some more light on this debate about intensification in cities. In the consultation process, there are often quite conflicting views. For instance, the front story shows multi-storey development hotel in Dunedin was turned down, and this was because people felt it really wouldn't reflect the characteristics they wanted in the area. So we wanted to ask how people felt about greater density of residential development in their own neighbourhood. Lots of people are fine with it in principle, but when it comes to their own backyard, people's preferences seem to change. So we wanted to ask that quite specifically. So we gave them multiple options for development: townhouses up to 2 storeys, apartments who are low-rise, medium-rise and high-rise. And we asked this question separately for each of those types and told people to rank them from 1, not comfortable at all, to 5, perfectly comfortable. So each of the columns here show the results for each of these different types of options we gave people. The first bar, for instance, shows townhouses up to 2 storeys. Now these blue responses, those were people who weren't comfortable with this type of development in their neighbourhood. These red responses are people who were comfortable or perfectly comfortable with this type of development in their neighbourhood, and the yellow is people who weren't sure. So as you can see, for townhouses and apartments up to 2 storeys, preferences are pretty evenly split between people who weren't comfortable and people who were comfortable, which I think is pretty significant. Now, the normal story we hear is that most people are opposed to intensification in their own neighbourhood, and this definitely comes through when we ask about medium-rise apartments and high-rise apartments. We also found, for instance, that when we broke this survey down by women, that women were definitely much more likely to be opposed to apartment living. All right, and we also broke this down by cities. So each graph shows responses along a scale from not comfortable to perfectly comfortable for Wellington and Auckland and elsewhere in New Zealand. So Auckland and Wellington are the yellow colour columns, and elsewhere in New Zealand is a brown colour column. And I apologise to anyone who's not from Auckland and Wellington, the colour choice wasn't meant to imply anything. Okay, so interestingly we find that there are a difference on average between Auckland and Wellington respondents and those from the rest of New Zealand. So you can see, for instance, here, when it comes to townhouses up to 2 storeys, there's quite a large difference between those who are perfectly comfortable in Wellington and Auckland and those who are perfectly comfortable from elsewhere in New Zealand. And that's about a 10% difference. However, when we look at more intensified development, this difference between Wellington and Aucklanders' responses and those from the rest of New Zealand did seem to diminish. All right, so the next question is to say, well, do people's preferences about more intensified development translate into government policy and citywide policy? So we've seen that to a certain level of intensification, people are 50-50, roughly half of people were okay or comfortable with a certain type of development in their own neighbourhood specifically. So we wanted to know, do people support a vision of a quality compact city, such as the Auckland Plan, in their own city? We found views were quite mixed. So roughly a third of people said yes, a third said no, and also a third were not concerned either way or just didn't know. So this is quite interesting. We found that high earners and the highly educated were more likely to say yes. And we also found people's preferences with this question were quite related to their own individual preferences in the questions that we asked earlier on. So for instance, the group who said no, they don't support such a vision, well, 72% of those respondents also said personally they wanted to live in a larger house further out. And we've broken it down by city. So here we've got the percentage of respondents from each city who said yes in the blue column, no in the sandy column, or not concerned either way / don't know in the brown column. So, not too surprisingly, in Auckland we see the most positive response to having a vision similar to the Auckland Plan in their own city, which I guess is a relief for Auckland planners out there. However, these answers seem to change as we go further south down the country, and Christchurch and Dunedin respondents were more likely to say no than any other city respondents. this is quite interesting as well. We can hypothesise as to why this is the case. So for instance, one reason might be Auckland and Wellington respondents might just have a lot of examples of positive apartment living, or places like Christchurch, for instance, might just have more on their plate when it comes to considering a decision of having a vision similar to the Auckland Plan for their own city. So we thought, all right, well, maybe people were looking at this question. Quite a significant portion of the population who responded said they weren't sure or weren't decided either way. So we thought, well, maybe people don't really know what the Auckland Plan is, or maybe people are just opposed to anything with Auckland in the title. So we thought, let's break it down a bit more. So here we just asked, at a baseline level, do you think councils should have the key role in defining the limits and form of the city, or do you think it should just be left up to market forces? I think without establishing this first point, then any other kind of consideration about future policy is kind of moot. But here we have the results. Very few people thought market forces should have the key role, although it is still a significant proportion. However, we see the majority of people thought that councils should have the key role in defining the limits and form of the city. Again, a number of people also just weren't sure about this proposition. Interestingly, when we compare the results from 2009 to this question, this is one of the few cases where results did indeed differ. So the proportion of people who said market forces should have the key role, this number of people decreased from 26% in 2009 to 18% in 2015. And this decrease was very large in Hamilton and also Dunedin, but not significant in Christchurch. We wanted to ask a bit more of a contentious question. Urban limits has been bandied around a lot. So we wanted to know, in your opinion, are urban limits necessary so that cities develop more sustainably, or do urban limits unnecessarily limit city development? We wanted to get a pretty broad opinion about where people sided on this argument about urban limits. And it seems to be that most people find that urban limits are necessary, with much fewer people responding that urban limits unnecessarily limit city development, although quite a significant proportion of respondents just weren't sure. So this is quite interesting and does show that despite majority preferences in an ideal world for a standalone house, and still majority preferences for a larger house, even if it means being further out, quite a few people were perfectly comfortable with intensification at a low level in their own neighbourhood, and indeed, most people thought that urban limits are necessary. So it shows us concern about sustainability in cities. But does this concern about sustainability, is it also present at policy at a national level or international level? So we wanted to ask a question about climate change. We asked, do you agree or disagree with the statement that there is an urgent need for policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand? And the majority of people did strongly agree and agree. So these results were quite interesting. We found that young people, those who are tertiary educated, women, and households with children were more likely to agree with the statement. We also found that the responses for this question were related to responses to previous questions. So those who thought market forces, for instance, should have the key role in city development were also more likely to oppose action to take against reducing greenhouse gases in New Zealand. So these links suggest policies potentially see similar lines between government intervention at a citywide level and government intervention at a nationwide level, but it also might mean that people see a link between issues of climate change mitigation and the way we run our cities. Alright, so for all of you who are keen for lunch, don't worry, this is the end. We've seen that views are pretty consistent over time, except for slight changes in preferences around travel time. But we've also seen that a lot of people were quite undecided about these questions, so this potentially indicates a need for wider debate and engagement. We found that most people were in favour of mixed-use developments, urban limits and council-guided urban development, and that people were willing to trade off in house size for shorter commutes and proximity to amenities. We also found that Wellington and Auckland respondents were more comfortable with intensification, and that New Zealanders generally saw a need for sustainability. All right, well, thank you for listening. You've been very patient. I'll now hand over for just a quick summary.
For me, some of the key issues that come through in this is, as we see a process of urban intensification gradually proceeding in New Zealand, at a pretty stately pace, I have to say. One of the issues is, how do local governments manage that, and how do they, balance their preferences against what central government is saying, which is, of course, one of the topics that the Productivity Commission is thinking about at the moment. I think my sense is that the central government has tended to wade in with rather simplistic nostrums around this and not really think about how local government has been balancing quite subtle trade-offs in the way they've been shaping their district plans and implementing those. You don't just go out and sprawl, make a subdivision on the edge of your city without thinking about it if you're a local government. There's lots of interesting and difficult pressures and incentives and payoffs there and future costs, so you'd need to think about those. And the question, the institutional question underlying all this is, have we got those institutional incentives and information and rules right? For example, Auckland Council have been trying to change their proposed Auckland Unitary Plan, and they've been trying to change their planning system. Have they got that right? Who's resisting the change? Why are they resisting the change? And where does that take us? And it's the Housing Accords type solution, which you know about, and then the Hatcher Act. Is that sort of Housing Accords approach a sensible approach? And in fact, we've done a paper which Nick and Ed and myself and others have been involved in, which is out to publication on that topic. So that's another insight into these issues around, central and local government and the tensions between them. So that's just a few observations. I could go on, as you know. But I really wanted to just thank you all for coming and thinking about these rather interesting and subtle topics and ones that have a lot of importance for sustainability in our future. So, yeah, thank you.